Hi everyone, bonjour tout le monde. My name is Emmanuelle L. I am a social worker and PhD student at the University of Ottawa. I'm honored to be here today to be partaking in these really important discussions on how to build an eco-social world together as social workers. And I'm presenting my PhD research and some results to you today. So I'm very excited to be here for that as well. I have a video that hasn't been diffused yet, so you'll be the first to have a look at this. And just to position myself, because this is an international conference, just so that you know about where I am. So the program itself was held in an area that's in Eastern Ontario, and this is on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and it's a French rural francophone region that that I worked in and that I've been working in for a while. So it's a familiar place for me. And what I would really want to do today is to really invite some discussions and some reflections around a relationship to nature, and also in the ways that we can help maybe build reciprocity with nature in future social work and eco-social work intervention. So without further ado, I thank you for being here and for listening, plugging in from far away or maybe close by. And I share my screen with you just to have a look at the presentation. So here we are. So today's title of the presentation is Cultivating Reciprocity, Rethinking Our Relationship to Nature Through Sport and Outdoor Therapy. So this falls into the themes of buen vivir, love and care of people and the planet, and responsibilities and rights. So just to set the pace for the conversation that we'll have today, I just wanted to do a little exercise, a reflection exercise. And one thing I've noticed throughout this process for myself in the PhD is actually how I made some realization about my own relationship to nature, and how sometimes it's difficult to shift epistemology or shift the way we think because we're so anchored in our ways. So because we're coming from maybe all over the world today watching this, and we might have a different standpoint, maybe a reflection, and you can write this down for your own, just to take a moment and take a moment to realize your own standpoint, where you're coming from, before we engage in the discussion. So what I'll do is I'll ask 3 questions. And when I ask one question, I encourage you to pause and just write down and document your thoughts on a piece of paper. And then you can unpause, listen to the next question, and do the same thing, so that you can actually take the time and write down your answers, just to really have this reflective practice as part of these conversations we'll have about building eco-social world. So the first question I have for you is, how would you describe your relationship to nature? And the second question is, if you were to imagine that humankind acted in reciprocity with nature, what would that look like? If you were to imagine that, what are you seeing in your mind? And the third question is, what would be different in your practice as a social worker if humankind was to act in reciprocity? How would we practice and do social work and research social work differently? So I'm imagining that you have answered the 3 questions, and that you're now back on this screen, and you've had time to reflect. And I'll go ahead and just present the plan for today's presentation. So first, I'll go through theoretical frameworks that I use for the research, but also to guide the way we design the program. I'll show you a video. So that's the video that was filmed, and just shows some snippets of what we did during the video. Then we'll talk about cultivating reciprocity and how that was, how I tried to do that in the program. And I'll offer some preliminary findings. So first is conceptualizing the climate crisis. So how did we get here? what happened that we got to this place of being a climate crisis. So one way of explaining this is through Rosa's sociology of our relationship to the world. And very briefly, what Rosa states is that the problem with modern Western societies is that we're in a state of acceleration, social acceleration that's always escalating. So we've been escalating this temporality since the industrialization period. And this leads us into a state of constant disconnection and alienation. So we've kind of lost connection with the world in a sense through this acceleration. So another thing that Rosa says, or what he explains, is that the way we relate to the world and to nature, it's really very much rooted in capitalism and the values that we hold dear in capitalism. And this is posing a huge problem in the way that we're interacting with the world, the way we're using nature, right? The way that we're interacting with nature. And so what can we do about that? What can we do to reverse this or to restore our relationship to nature and to the world? And what Rosa suggests is that we need to enter into a shift into a reconnection and to experience moments of resonance. So be in resonance with the world. And when he talks about resonance, it's about really meaningfully engaging with the world. And resonance is very much a discursive and embodied practice. So by discursive, I mean that the way we relate to the world and to nature, it's based on the language we use, on the words we use to describe it, and also to interact with it, and also on the narrative that is built around relationship to nature and to the world. And it's very much embodied because experience passes through or stems from the body. So we feel relationships as well. And the way we engage with relationships goes through the body. So it's a very much lived and embodied experience. And in the what can we do, I'm just adding here some words from Robin Kimmerer, which is a writer, indigenous scientist and writer. And what she says is we also have to unlearn the settler view of the land. So Rosa doesn't talk about it in these terms, but he does talk about changing the relationship to the world. And what I'm adding here is maybe that notion of unlearning and deconstructing the view that's been very much anchored in Western societies of how we interact with land, and shifting that as well. So in order to look at embodied experience and study lived experience, I'm also adding as a complementary frame, the frame of carnal sociology by Loïc Vacant. And this is a frame actually that's very useful to value body knowledge. So in social work, we've been, or at least in Western social work, we've been working more with cognitive and mind-based approaches and leaving the body out of research, out of practice, and thinking very much in a disembodied way of doing research and practice. So with carnal sociology, I was hoping to bring the body back as a legitimate site of knowledge. So how is the climate crisis a problem of relationships? And I've mentioned this briefly, and I'm just going to read out a citation from the coordinator of Extinction Rebellion that she was talking on a webinar, and she was saying how we often say that the system is broken. However, the system is working exactly like it's supposed to be working according to how it was built. So basically the way that Western society was built is leading to the climate crisis. So what is happening today is rooted in the way we build the system. So there's this, on the one hand, the Western view of nature and land, and we can think of this as an anthroponormative or anthropocentric relationship that was built, where the humans are kind of viewing themselves as being on top, and their rights and their needs are on top of every other living being's needs and rights, right? So the priority is human and people, and very disproportionately, I might add, with ecological injustice and social injustices in there. But if we look at anthroponormative views, it's really about interacting with nature in certain ways that was built through time, through the few last 100 years. So viewing nature as commodity, viewing nature as an economic resource, or even as a resource for self-development. So where I live, for example, there's all these really beautiful natural spaces, and the way people interact with it is very much in a recreational way most of the time. So I would say the dominant way of interacting with nature for the everyday life is through recreation purposes and kind of enjoyment for our own well-being, but it's a very unidirectional relationship that's being nurtured. And what Rosa would say as well is the way we interact with nature, in the sense that it brings a lot of disconnection. And Louvre also reinstates that with looking at children and overconsumption of technology. There's been that disconnect from nature, that we just don't know we just don't know nature. We've lost that connection and that knowledge that nature can bring. And then there's these alternative views. So I'm using Thésée and Carr's term, alternative views, just to reiterate the fact that these alternative views are very much anchored in a different epistemology than Western societies, and different assumptions are behind these views as well. So Besthorn, which is a social worker, he wrote in environmental social work, he talks about more of a land ethics kind of view, where we're giving equal moral standing and equal value to land and to all living beings. And then we can talk about ecocentric epistemology, in the sense where the humans and all living beings are all equally, they all equally matter, right? So there's not one above the other, and there's that interdependency and interrelationship that's being put forth. And then if we go to the lens of indigenous wisdom, and this is in Kimmerer, has a podcast actually on reciprocity. If you want to listen, it's really great. It's short and it's wonderful, where she states that from the indigenous wisdom lens, there's land as a source of identity. And she talks about land as our sustainer, land as home for people and more than human relatives, and also land as teacher and healer. And so what is reciprocity, and why is it important to consider for eco-social work? So one of the things you might have heard of reciprocity in social work, where we talk mainly of reciprocity in relationships and human relationships, right? In couple therapy or in family therapy. But if we talk about reciprocity, when we talk about nurturing reciprocity with land and nature, it's a little bit of a different view, because we're interacting with natural spaces, right? And rethinking reciprocity doesn't come all that naturally for Westerners, or for people who grew up with Western philosophy, because we were not used to thinking that way. So there's kind of that epistemological obstacle that's happening when we talk about, or when we think about reciprocity. So the concept, when in relation to nature, is rooted in indigenous wisdom and worldviews. And Kimmerer again talks about healing through reciprocity. And there's also one theoretical framework that I found in environmental social work that talks about redefining restoration to include human in reciprocal relationship with the natural environment. So the model is called reciprocal ecosystem restoration model, and that's from a conservation biology perspective. So in that model, they talk about ecological and human restoration, and how these are interrelated, and how can they help each other out, and engaging in a relationship that benefits humans and nature and earth others and local ecosystems, which in turns will also benefit global ecosystems. So basically, building reciprocity as a means by which we can restore relationships to nature and shift towards ecocentric epistemologies was one of the thought processes I had in building this program, and in hoping to instill some ways of enacting reciprocity, or getting more comfortable with that notion and knowing what that means. Because as I said, it doesn't come naturally if we're used to just using nature for our own purposes. So the research I conducted was a multi-sited action research. The first site, which I won't talk too much about today, was working with youth activists, where I had the chance to do interviews with 10 wonderful youth activists, and also I had some observant participation with Environnement Jeunesse, which is a youth-led organization, ecological organization. And also I got to do a focus group with 5 of the 10 young people. And the goal really was to understand the social ecological transition from their standpoint, from their perspective, and also to include them in a reflective process where we think about what do we need to include in an eco-social work program so that we're really engaging with some components that are relative to the social ecological transition. So their ideas are integrated, or most of their ideas were integrated into the program. And then side 2 was the program itself, which was held last September, so September 2021, with a group of 5 young people. And we were quite limited with the number of young people because we were entering another wave of COVID-19. So this 5 was the maximal amount, but which was great because we had a lot of time to bond and to spend time with those 5 young people. And so there was that co-creation process that's intrinsic to the multi-sided action research, where we also collaborated with various social actors from our community and partnerships as well with local organizations. So just to specify the questions, the first site, so with the youth activists, was to define the social ecological transition according to the lived experience of youth eco-activists, and also to understand the issues of young people, so how young people are experiencing the climate change itself, but also what obstacle are they foreseeing in climate action. And then the second site was embodying ecocentric epistemology, co-designing a sport and nature-based program with a strong eco-social component. And my questions for this part of the research were, how can an eco-social sport and nature-based program be a lever for the social ecological transition? And then what mechanisms enable alternative ways of relating to the world, to self, to health, and to nature? And then this is probably more a little bit of a result, but also a thought process that guided the program, is to turn to reciprocity as a conceptual and experiential tool to foster alternative ways of being and relating to nature. So the steps of an action research, there's multiple steps. I won't go through them all today, but just to say that it is a very collaborative approach. So I had the chance to collaborate with a local health center where a social worker came to co-facilitate the program with me, and also with the local forestry department, where I got to, the forestry expert, or I will call her an ally of the forest, came to co-host one of the sessions. And we also collaborated with a local bike shop, which I also co-own. And it's a social service and bike shop oriented service in the forest. So just to have some bike rentals or some bikes available for the young people. And also with different collaborators from the community that were kind of mentors for the young people. Those collaborators were chosen on the basis of them enacting the social ecological transition in one way or another. So the session was in a forest setting, and you will notice in the video that it's a recreational forest and it's a logging forest. So it's a site that's very active. It's a human active site, I guess, in some parts of the forest. And where we held the program, it was never in deep wilderness. So you'll notice we're often on the path or close to parking lots or the main road, which is a very small road, but we're never very deep because it was a short program. So only 3 hours per session. We had 8 sessions, and then 1 extra session was a celebration and focus group. And so I named the scale of these outdoor and therapy sessions micro adventures, because we're not doing some expedition or big adventures. So they're close by. There were 3 main components to the program and objectives that are relative to each component. So the first component was therapeutic and reflective. So engaging into reflective practices and also engaging in deconstructing narrative, right? To kind of unpack the relationship to nature and restore and reconstruct according to a preferred identity. And then we had the eco-pedagogical component, where we integrated some environmental education principles to learn with and from the forest, and also some sports and movement component where we had sport as a psycho educational tool or psychosocial development tool, and movement like yoga. The data collection was conducted by observant participation. So as a registered social worker, I could partake also as a practitioner researcher, which enabled me to experience the program with participants and also to facilitate it with the co-facilitator. Journaling as well, where I purposefully journaled as much as possible outside in nature to be closer to my own embodied experiences, and also spontaneous interviewing that was done. And we also recorded all the sessions where I had a recorder on my backpack. So I was able to record the sessions of the welcoming opening group and then the closing group as well at each session. And then we did a focus group at the end. So this is the participants here that you see. So the program was called Pieds sur Terre, Feet to Earth. And I will show you a video. So the first time that it's being diffused, I'm very happy to share this with you.
Alors, mon nom, c'est Emmanuelle L, je suis étudiante au doctorat en travail social, puis je fais une recherche au fait ici sur un programme d'intervention qui s'appelle Pieds sur Terre, puis je suis aussi travailleuse sociale de formation et yoga thérapeute certifiée. Puis la transition. Je travaille avec le centre de santé de l'Estrie, Jean-Sébastien Larocque, qui est l'autre intervenant qui travaille avec nous. Donc, on est 2 intervenants avec un groupe de jeunes de 18 à 30 ans. Donc, on intègre vraiment le sport comme objet thérapeutique dans le programme d'intervention. Ça nous a permis peut-être renforcer les liens aussi entre les participants. Donc, il y a tout cet aspect groupal-là qui permet d'être ensemble, de s'entraider, de s'encourager, puis de former des connexions, des liens avec des gens peut-être qu'on n'aurait pas vraiment eu la chance de connaître sans ce programme-là, puis d'apprendre à connaître des gens peut-être qu'on n'aurait pas pensé s'entendre bien avec. Là, finalement, dans le contexte, c'est quelqu'un qu'on découvre vraiment nos propres forces au travers de ces personnes-là, puis les forces des personnes. Puis là, pour aider à intégrer, on travaille beaucoup avec l'approche narrative. Puis l'approche narrative, c'est une approche d'intervention dans laquelle moi et Jean-Sébastien, on est formés. On a eu nos formations en Nouvelle-Zélande, en Australie, puis ici au Canada. Donc, on utilise une méthodologie qui s'appelle l'arbre de la vie. Puis à chacune des sessions, on bâtit une différente partie de notre arbre. C'est vraiment une méthodologie qui est bien ancrée. Puis on l'a adaptée justement pour faire parler les gens par rapport à leur lien à la nature. Puis c'est vraiment adapté à plein de différentes situations ou problématiques. Puis ça peut être utilisé dans un contexte communautaire ou avec des individus, mais nous autres, on a décidé de l'adapter pour que ce soit plus un arbre de la vie qui nous aide à explorer notre relation à la nature. L'intégration, parce qu'on bâtit notre arbre la semaine passée, donc on a fait les racines, puis c'était vraiment le lien qu'on a à la nature, comme qu'est-ce qui nous enracine dans ce ligne-là. Donc, vous avez un peu nommé comme les places qui étaient spéciales pour vous. On explore une section de l'arbre par session d'intervention. Puis, ça va permettre, on espère que ça va aider aux participants à apprendre à se connaître à travers de ça, puis à apprendre aussi à connaître leurs forces, puis en lien avec la relation à la nature, ce que ça veut dire, c'est quoi le sens qu'ils donnent à la nature pour eux autres. Puis, vu qu'il y a un volet très écologique, donc on parle du travail écosocial là, dans mon groupe d'intervention, donc on veut vraiment mettre ce volet écologique-là en central au programme pour qu'on puisse voir le lien entre la santé et la santé planétaire en même temps, puis travailler là-dessus. Alors, cet arbre-là, on veut dire qu'on le bâtit, ça va permettre justement de réfléchir à comment on peut nous autres s'impliquer ou comment on peut penser plus notre santé en termes de santé écologique en même temps.
Ça m'a rendu encore plus intéressé à en apprendre plus sur le projet. Mais je trouve que l'énergie de groupe, c'était ça qui
comme juste de réaliser, comme apprécier, comme this has been here my entire life pretty much. I haven't touched it in like 5 years.
Mais plus ça avançait, plus j'étais comme non, comme j'ai besoin de ça, j'aime ça, j'aime le groupe, j'aime la dynamique.
Les 3 dernières sessions, je me sentais même pas forcée à sortir, j'avais hâte. Ce programme, je le dis toujours à mon mari, qui est arrivé comme un bon moment porteur dans ma vie, que ça m'a permis de sortir, de retrouver mon amour avec la nature. Et puis je trouve ça cool quand c'est comme, tu sais, du monde comme, je sais pas, j'avais jamais rencontré ce monde-là dans ma vie en général. Ça, je trouve ça le fun, je trouve ça cute, puis beau à voir, de comme tu rencontres, puis tu crées comme des relations avec des gens, puis tu sais, des fois, c'est comme, ça passe vite, mais comme, tu en gardes toujours quelque chose, selon moi, là, puis je trouve que c'est comme des, je sais pas, c'est cute, j'aime ça.
Je sais pas si vous le savez, là, mais je vais parler de vous autres toute ma vie, by the way.
So there it was. Let me reshare my screen with you. So what snippets of the program is what you saw today. Now I'll just explain a little bit more of what that was and what we did. So basically the frames for the practice, which reflect my own areas of expertise, and the co-facilitator Jean-Sébastien Larocque, his area of expertise as well is narrative therapy, outdoor and adventure therapy, and yoga therapy. So the first narrative therapy was the main therapeutic approach that we used, and in relation to nature, it was really an approach that was used to help restore relationship to nature. So we adapted the Tree of Life methodology, which is an existing methodology that I was explaining in the video. And it was building this tree, so drawing and journaling the tree, basically to look at, participants could look at their own relationship to nature, the roots of that, and also fostering a preferred identity and seeing what the hopes and dreams are to go towards that identity and the means by which they can enable that. So the Tree of Life methodology was one tool that we used throughout the whole program. So it lasted for the whole session, the 8 sessions. And we used the tree metaphor elsewhere as well, through the partner tree exercise, for example, which is what you see on the pictures here, is having a mindfully walking towards or listening to what the trees might have say to us, and maybe touching the trees and interacting with the tree, and letting one tree find us, in a sense, so that participants could just sit down by the tree and get to know the tree a little bit, and journal, take the time to journal and reflect beside. And then we also did a land art collective Tree of Life activity, which consisted of building a Tree of Life just using some pieces of leaves or what they found, without disturbing the forest too much. We were still going with an ethics, land ethics. So we didn't want to disturb the forest, but just creating that collective tree. And that was used to reinstate the fact that the change process is not solely on the individual, but it's very much a collective endeavor that we need to foster. And the second frame was sports and nature-based therapy, also called outdoor and adventure therapy. So this is an experiential embodied approach that's based in that mobilizes environmental education and therapeutic tools. So it's a very flexible approach used with various methods and various therapeutic methods that can be integrated. There's also various scales and objectives that we can mobilize this type of approach for. So for this program, one of the things that I found important was to foster a slow pedagogy of place where we could kind of linger in moments a little bit more, but also use the sports for ecosocial development. So learning to have the body in motion and with experiencing different rhythms and getting to know nature and different aspects of it. So the bike riding was great to explore different areas of the forest. We also did a night riding session and also went to a local farm. So that was great to get places as well, since we had a short period, 3-hour period, so we could conduct our activities. And then yoga therapy. So I'm a yoga therapist, so I was able to give the yoga activities as well. So one of the things, and this is with yoga, it's been very westernized as well. So I was trying to mobilize, especially yoga philosophy in the program, because there is, within this yoga philosophy, there's that idea of interrelationship, right? Of that interaction between mind and body and spirit, but also between the humans and living beings, of us being a microcosm of a bigger macrocosm. And to frame the program, I used the 5 elements. So a couple of elements came back more than once because we had 8 sessions, but I framed it as a theme and then building the sub-themes around that. So it was a very flexible approach, and it was very important that I keep the program flexible to get to talk to participants to see how they maybe wanted to contribute, and also to see if they wanted to make any modifications. So the themes really help to mobilize that reciprocal element as well through the thematic, through yogic thematic elements. And so to cultivate reciprocity, yoga was used to create attunement, so to tune in to our bodies and to nature, and also to foster some stillness, so to be in touch, or to evoke some resonance or experiences of resonance. We also need to listen and to be still for a while, and just to be mindful of what's around us. So pay attention. So learning to pay attention, and also attention, which leads to intention. And this is Robin Kimmerer who says that paying attention can lead to having an intention, and having that intention of reciprocity. That was the end goal of the program. For a collective action. And then observation, so setting the body up to be able to observe and to receive, and also to not only to receive, but to respond in a responsive way to nature. And then cultivating gratitude as well through yoga practices, and again reinstating that interconnectedness through yoga philosophy. So setting the scene was an important factor, how we enter natural spaces, how we enter the forest. And one of the questions I had at the back of my mind, and that was kind of stemming from my phase 1 research with the youth eco-activist, who talked a whole lot about decolonization and decolonizing practices, and how to instill that in a program or an outdoor nature program. So setting the scene was important to foster that different narrative from the get-go, from as soon as we step into the forest, seeing the forest as a gift, right? So having this different languaging around how we can settle in, so allowing participants to arrive. So we had often you can see blankets, and we had some tea as well, some herbal tea, so that they could kind of settle into the pace and look for the pace of nature, because it was a very changing, we were in the fall, so we got to see the leaves changing in the first snowfall, so it was great. But also to get into that just that mindset of, okay, I'm in nature, I'm with nature, and how do I need to act to be respectful to nature? And so we had always the first few minutes was to go through the program schedule and allow participants to settle. And then we would also do either breathing or yoga practice, or a meditation practice that was often themed around the element or on attunement or gratitude. So just again, kind of fostering that gratitude for land. Thank you for allowing us to be here today and to be able to learn from you today. It was the message that we were trying to convey. So within these sessions, one of the things that we try to do is attuning so that we could better learn from the forest and kind of rediscover the forest, because a lot of the participants already knew that forest, right? They knew they'd been there before, just as I had been there before quite often, but not in the same way. And that was a big, that was actually a big step for me as well, or an evolution where to really rediscover with kind of new sets of, I'll say ecocentric spectacles or lenses, but just to really be more mindful of what the forest was speaking at during each day and each session, and learning about the history and the colonial roots of the forest, which I was not aware of before the program. And then we had the forestry experts, which I called again an ally of the forest, because she's very passionate about respecting the forest and taking care and in terms of stewardship. So leaving no trace principle, and then also learning, she taught us to call the living beings by their names by learning to recognize and interact with trees and mushrooms and plants. So the stands that we took during that discovery walk, particularly, was one of our archaeologists and detective and curiosity. And as a reflective piece to end that session was The Honorable Harvest by Robin Kimmerer. And then just getting reacquainted with the forest in different contexts. So the sports and nature therapy aspect was great for that. So for example, the bike riding at night session, we really got to know about the participants' fear of going in the forest or in the darkness and not knowing the sounds of the forest, never experiencing the forest at night, for example, and then kind of deconstructing those fears. And even one participant was saying how it's almost like being an animal yourself in an animal context. So getting to know about what it would be like to live more, like rewilding ourselves in the process, and then experiencing the forest as place and as a community as well. And then another aspect that we really focused on was mobilizing community collaborators. So that was one very rich aspect of the program for youth, for participants who shared that those interactions they had were quite meaningful to them. So they learned just different ways of being, and the goal was to mobilize a variety of knowledges through community collaborations and to experience different means through which reciprocity can flourish. So for example, we had a musician coming in who's also a leader in the community with community gardens and food sustainability and food justice. And one of the participants, she had the idea of sharing a vegan meal. So, and then we had one youth activist from the phase 1 coming in and act as mentor to talk about her relationship to water, and where she worked in a water conservation organization. And then we had some recapitulative documents, so narrative documents that were sent to participants, just as a way of helping them, hoping to help transpose new learnings in everyday life. So this was kind of questions, like for example, when we had a permaculture session with a person who does permaculture and interacted with alpacas on an alpaca farm. So learning about those permaculture principles and relating those to reciprocal relationship to nature, and asking participants how they incorporate this into their lives. So it was really an invitation to extend the reflection at home. And then as a the final goal of the program was returning the gift, so enacting reciprocity. So we had talked about that. It was a main theme that kind of was consistent throughout the program. And the objective was to move reciprocity, the concept, from an abstraction to tangible action, and then move also beyond individualism. So having that collective aspect of action and changing the narrative on restoring relationship to nature. And even when we talk about sustainability or eco activism or acts of ecology, it's sometimes a very much individual behavior that we focus on, but I think for building an eco-social world, we really need to focus on the collective power of action, and also on the macro social aspects of the climate change. So really it was about empowerment or agency and responsibility, fostering responsibility, but especially agency in knowing, okay, yes, there is a way to act reciprocally with nature. And what does that mean? What does that look like? So the collective action was decided by and with participants. And what we ended up doing was, so they had a range of ideas, and then we also talked to the forestry department to kind of get to know of what are the issues that are being experienced within the forest. For example, they were saying there's a lot of people dumping garbage. There's not enough education on dumping garden leftovers, and then there's all these invasive species that are growing in the forest. So how can we as a group maybe do something for the forest according to what we know about what the issues are? So we had this wood that was donated from a local woodworker, and the participants made some signs for a new pollinator habitat. So the forest, some trees had been cut down, and the people of the community were a little bit upset about that. So the forest wanted to show that it was actually building a pollinator habitat in that area. So we made some signs to indicate that and indicate the compost in the forest. And one participant had the idea of encouraging people to pause and breathe and look around and observe. So there was a sign about that as well, which they're not put up, but maybe they will be by the time of this conference, because it was winter when we completed the signs. So their objective was really to educate, raise awareness, and also to show their gratitude to the forest. So to recapitulate, cultivating reciprocity, how we tried to do that was by setting the tone and seeing forest as gift, also instilling decolonization practices as much as possible in relationship to nature, and in changing the narrative. So Tree of Life methodology was a helpful tool in that, because it was really the reflective means by which the participants could think of their own and restory their own relationship to nature. And one other aspect was having an accessible and actionable practices. So not having when we think of reciprocity, like I was saying, it was kind of difficult to understand and to put into action, because we're not used to thinking that way in Western societies. So it had to be an action that was possible and doable and within the time limits that we had. Community collaboration, and I think that was one unique aspect of the program, is that we didn't stay just in the forest, but we really wanted to extend that notion of attachment to place that included the forest and the community, and working together. And then installing some mentorship as well, so that young people could have these intergenerational interactions, and also finding some inspiration and maybe some mentorship from people within the community. And then going into collective action, just to really veer away from that individualistic practice of self-responsibility towards eco-centric or eco behavior. So some limitations: it was a very small and non-generalizable sample. And also because it's a micro social intervention, perhaps we didn't look at too much of the micro aspects, the macro social aspects of the climate crisis and of relationship to nature and of the roots of all that, although it was reflected upon, but that macro aspect was not included in the program. And as well, the risk of just responsibilizing the individual. And of course, being in an anthropocentrism and Western concept, like I said, the concept of reciprocity was not near, it wasn't a very accessible notion. So I think it was maybe the next step would be to think about, okay, what do we need to put into practice so that reciprocity becomes more accessible as a practice, as an everyday practice in society. So just those preliminary results. Like I said, there was that, I'll call it an epistemological glitch, where I'm kind of imagining a computer screen that freezes, where you mention something or something happens and it just kind of freezes, or sometimes that happens in therapy as well, when you ask a question that is just too far for the person, and we need to bring it closer so that it's accessible. So the concept of reciprocity kind of caused that epistemological glitch, because it's not in our normal narrative, in our everyday narrative in practice. So how to get those practices of reciprocity accessible and closer to build on that. And one result was shifting the narrative, and that came pretty early on in the program, where a relational language was used to describe relationship to nature. And I have a citation here from one participant, Virginie, who described that nature is like a friend. If you spend less time with her, it's certain your connection will not be as solid than if you would spend time with her every week. Bottom line, nature is a friendship. So that was the second group, the second session, where nature was described as friendship. And so we could really build on that. And as social workers, I encourage that spontaneity in integrating those words that come from participants, or what's happening in nature, what nature brings as well, to kind of take that and uphold that when we're leading programs in the forest, instead of having standardized protocols. And then broadening the identity. So where some participants were really going into nature for their own needs or their own self-development, there was an evolution of them describing themselves as part of a whole. So that was different in vocabulary in the end of the program. And then in rediscovering the local forest, there was a keen interest to that. So that was a really meaningful moment for many participants, where they really developed that interest of, oh, I want to know more about this. I really like this, and what else can I learn from nature? There's that natural curiosity that was shown. So that was really an interesting result as well. And then getting out of the comfort zone, so that can be a great learning opportunity for coping skills, for example. But if we think for ecosocial development, that feeling of discomfort. So we had one session in 40 millimeters of rain, and everybody was very cold and wet. And then we did the night ride. So there was these stepping out of the natural context or comfort zone, which made them, there was a realization of privilege as well. So privilege of being able to take shelter and have a shower, and even a discussion about questioning this food system. And, well, how come I'm able to eat strawberries every day when we should be focusing more on local agricultural or regenerative agriculture, which is what they had learned from the permaculture activity. And then cultivating the resonant body. So one thing was the role of yoga and meditation in slowing down the practices, so that participants could really be in their body and notice and be attentive to nature. And that came through as well, where one of the participants was explaining how yoga, or the meditation part, kind of helped prepare his body for attention and for reception, and to be more receptive to what nature was bringing. And then just discovering new ways of living in harmony with nature. So one participant had mentioned that it was actually surprising that it was a doable thing. For example, starting a permaculture garden in her own backyard, where she thought it would be very complicated and having to quit her job. But in the end, we don't have to modify everything in our life to live with ecocentric endeavors or sustainably. And then, of course, that gratitude versus and empathy versus selfishness. So they had identified selfishness as one of the root causes of our problematic relationship to the world, when we had the discussion at the end in the focus group. And then building on discussion on gratitude and empathy, they were saying it was maybe something to build on at a very young age, to start at a very young age, instead of building individualism and selfishness. And so I thank you all for listening and for partaking in this discussion. I invite you to email me if you have anything you want to add, if you want to exchange ideas. I would love to hear from you. So I acknowledge, first of all, I'm very grateful for the youth eco-activists who collaborated on this program, and for the young adults, the young people who made this research possible and participated very actively in the program. So They were there every day, and it was great. We had a great time actually, and I thank them very dearly. And of course, our community partners, which wouldn't have been the same without them. I really found that having these partners in the community helped to extend those different knowledges, and also to learn about the community in which the forest is nearby. So that was great. And also the project was partly financed by some grants. And I just finished with one quote from Robin Kimmerer. So I say, in ecosocial work education, and then I quote Robin Kimmerer, how can we create systems that generates ecological compassion for the living world and generates in our students and in ourselves a sense of agency, that we have the ability to answer that question of what does the earth ask of us? That we are givers to the earth, not just passive takers. And so I leave you with that today. Again, thank you very much. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if you want to exchange ideas.